Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because we dive deep into the most iconic cars that shaped American automotive history. Today, we're talking about a car that doesn't just turn heads, it stops traffic. We're talking about the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, and not just any Eldorado, but specifically those towering, gravity-defying tailfins that made this car a legend. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, another video about tailfins. But here's the thing. The 1959 Cadillac didn't just have tailfins. It had the tallest, sharpest, most outrageous fins ever bolted onto a production car. We're talking 42.5 inches high. That's over 3.5 feet of pure, unapologetic excess jutting out from the back of this beast. These fins weren't subtle, they weren't restrained, they were a middle finger to practicality and a love letter to the space age. And they tell us everything we need to know about America in 1959, a country that was confident, ambitious, and absolutely obsessed with rockets, jets, and the future. So buckle up, because we're going back to 1959. We're going to explore why Cadillac built this automotive monument, what it was like to live in that era, and why these fins became both celebrated and controversial. We'll talk about the design genius behind them, the Cold War context that inspired them, and what it cost to own one of these rolling works of art. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado represents the absolute peak and the beginning of the end of America's tailfin era. Let's get into it. Section 1. The Man Behind the Fins, Harley Earl. To understand why the 1959 Cadillac looked the way it did, you first need to understand the man who made it possible, Harley Earl. Born in 1893 in Hollywood, California, Earl came from a family of coach builders. His father started Earl Automobile Works in 1908, customizing luxury cars for Hollywood's elite. Young Harley grew up around beautiful cars and wealthy clients who wanted something nobody else had. In 1926, Earl's life changed forever. Lawrence Fisher, the manager of GM's Cadillac division, visited Earl's shop and was blown away by what he saw. Fisher was particularly impressed by Earl's use of modeling clay to sculpt car designs, a technique that's still used today. Fisher brought Earl to Detroit to design the 1927 LaSalle, and the rest is history. The LaSalle was such a success that GM President Alfred P. Sloan created something unprecedented, a dedicated design department. In 1927, the Art and Color section was born, with Harley Earl as its first director. Think about that for a second. Before Earl, car companies didn't even have design departments. Engineers built cars based purely on function and cost. Earl changed everything. By the late 1950s, Earl had become a vice president at General Motors, the first styling executive to reach that level in any major American corporation. He supervised the design of roughly 35 million cars during his career. His philosophy was simple but revolutionary. My primary purpose for 28 years has been to lengthen and lower the American automobile, at times in reality, and always at least in appearance. But Earl's biggest contribution? Tail fins. The story goes back to 1941. Earl saw the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-boom fighter aircraft, and was fascinated by its vertical stabilizers. Those twin tails looked fast, powerful, and futuristic. Earl thought, what if we put that on a car? The first Cadillac with modest tail fins appeared in 1948. They were small, understated bumps on the rear fenders. But Earl kept pushing. Every year, the fins got bigger. By 1957, Chrysler's chief designer, Virgil Exner, had gotten into the game, creating his own dramatic fins. The competition was on. Earl took it personally. Exner had actually worked for GM in the 1930s before joining Chrysler, so this was a battle between former colleagues. The 1959 Cadillac was Earl's response, his final statement before mandatory retirement at age 65 in December 1958. Those massive fins? They were Earl saying, "This is how you do tail fins. This is excess perfected." And he was right. Nobody would ever top them. The 1959 Cadillac was literally Harley Earl's last hurrah, his retirement gift to the American public. It would also mark the beginning of the end for tail fins. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Section 2. America. In 1959, the world that created this car. To really understand the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, you need to understand what America was like in 1959. This wasn't just any year. This was peak Cold War, peak space race, peak American confidence. Let's set the scene. World War II had ended just 14 years earlier. America was now locked in an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. The Cold War wasn't a traditional war. There were no pitched battles between American and Soviet troops. Instead, it was a competition to prove which system was superior: American capitalism and democracy or Soviet communism. This competition played out in multiple arenas: nuclear weapons, military technology, economic growth, and, crucially, space exploration. In October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Americans were shocked. The Soviet Union, still recovering from losing 27 million citizens in World War II, had beaten us into space. President Eisenhower himself said, "I had no idea that the American people were so psychologically vulnerable." The response was swift. In 1958, the United States created NASA. Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, pumping money into math and science education. The space race was officially on. Then, in September 1959, the same year this Cadillac rolled off the assembly line, the Soviets launched Luna 2, the first man-made object to touch the moon. 2 years later, in April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. America was behind. We were playing catch-up. And that created a fascinating psychological environment. On one hand, Americans were genuinely worried. The same rockets that could put satellites in orbit could deliver nuclear warheads. The stakes were existential. But on the other hand, Americans were experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The economy was booming. The suburbs were expanding. Families had money to spend on cars, televisions, appliances, and vacations. The American dream felt real and achievable. This created a unique cultural moment: anxiety mixed with optimism, fear of nuclear war mixed with excitement about the future. And nowhere was this tension more visible than in car design. Automakers drew inspiration from jet fighters and rockets. They wanted their cars to look fast, powerful, and futuristic, even when parked. Chrome was everywhere. Grills looked like jet intakes. Dashboard switches mimicked airplane cockpit controls. And, of course, tail fins. Tail fins were meant to evoke rocket stabilizers and fighter jet tails. They said, "We're living in the space age. We're building the future. We're Americans, and we're not afraid of anything." Cadillac's marketing materials for the 1959 Eldorado explicitly played up the aerospace connection. Some ads even dubbed it the astronaut's choice. The twin bullet-shaped tail lights? They were supposed to look like rocket exhaust. It sounds absurd today, but in 1959, it made perfect sense. Space was everywhere in popular culture. Kids played with toy rockets. Families watched sci-fi movies about conquering the stars. The future was supposed to be clean, shiny, atomic-powered, and covered in chrome. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado was a rolling embodiment of that dream. It was nearly 19 feet long, weighed over 5,000 pounds, and guzzled gas without apology. It was excess for excess's sake. But that was the point. In 1959, America was the richest, most powerful nation on Earth. Why shouldn't our cars reflect that? Why be subtle when you could be spectacular? Of course, this attitude wouldn't last. By the mid-1960s, tailfins would disappear. Tastes would change. But in 1959, bigger was better, and the Cadillac Eldorado was the biggest, boldest statement on four wheels. Section 3. The design and engineering of the 1959 Eldorado. Now let's talk about the car itself. What made the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado so special? The design team included some serious talent. Chuck Jordan, Dave Halls, and Ed Glowacki all worked under Harley Earl and his successor, Bill Mitchell. These weren't just car designers, they were artists trying to create something that had never been seen before. The result was stunning, controversial, and impossible to ignore. Let's start with the dimensions. The 1959 Eldorado sat on a 130-inch wheelbase and stretched 225 inches from bumper to bumper. That's 18 feet, 9 inches. For comparison, a modern Cadillac Escalade, considered a huge vehicle today, is about 210 inches long. So yeah, this thing was massive. It weighed over 5,000 pounds. The curb weight varied slightly depending on options, but you were looking at roughly 2.5 tons of American steel and chrome. And speaking of chrome, oh man, the chrome. The 1959 Cadillac had pounds and pounds of it. The bumpers alone were multi-piece steel stampings, chrome-plated and bolted together. They were a die maker's nightmare, complex, heavy, and expensive to produce. But they looked spectacular. The front end featured a shark-mouth grille flanked by dual bullet-shaped headlamps. Cadillac called them jewel-like, and honestly, that's accurate. They sparkled. 10 vertical chrome slashes sat ahead of the open rear wheel housings. A C-shaped chrome trim ran from the front fenders, along the body, back toward the rear, then returned forward along the side sills. But the real star of the show? Those tail fins? At 42.5 inches tall, they were the highest fins ever fitted to a production car. They were sharp, dramatic, and V-shaped. Sitting in the middle of each V were twin bullet-shaped taillights, painted bright red and designed to look like rocket exhaust flames. The styling was so distinctive that even people who know nothing about cars can recognize a 1959 Cadillac instantly. Interestingly, not all 1959 Cadillacs had these monster fins. The Eldorado Brougham, a hand-built ultra-luxury four-door sedan, came with much more modest fins. These Broughams were assembled in Italy by Pininfarina. Only 99 were built in 1959, and they cost a staggering $13,075. That's over $140,000 in today's dollars. But the regular Eldorado Biarritz convertible and Eldorado Seville hardtop? Those had the full treatment, the huge fins, the dual rocket lights, all the chrome you could ask for. Now let's talk power. Under the hood, the 1959 Eldorado packed a 390 cubic inch V8 engine. That's 6.4 liters for those of you thinking in metric. With 3 two-barrel carburetors, a setup known as tri-power, this engine produced 345 horsepower and 435 lb-ft of torque. By modern standards, that doesn't sound like much. But remember, this was 1959. Most family cars had 150 horsepower or less. The Eldorado was a rocket ship by comparison. Power went through a 3-speed hydromatic automatic transmission. No manual option was offered. This was a luxury car, after all. The Eldorado also featured air suspension, which was pioneered by the 1957 Brougham. The air suspension provided a cloud-like ride and automatically leveled itself based on load. Unfortunately, it was also leak-prone and troublesome. Cadillac would abandon it after 1960 due to reliability complaints. Inside, the Eldorado was opulent. Leather upholstery. Power everything. Windows, seats, door locks, steering, brakes. 6-way power front seats, automatic transmission, fog lamps, dual mirrors, a radio with rear speaker, white wall tires. On the Brougham, you also got air conditioning, cruise control, and an automatic headlight dimmer. The base price for a 1959 Eldorado Biarritz convertible was $7,400. That's roughly $78,000 today. Not cheap, but not outrageous for a top-of-the-line luxury convertible. Production numbers were low. Cadillac built just 1,220 Biarritz convertibles in 1959. Only 975 Seville hardtops were made. Combined with the 99 hand-built Broughams, you're looking at fewer than 2,400 Eldorados total. Today, a well-preserved 1959 Eldorado Biarritz can fetch you $150,000 or more at auction. The rarest examples with unique options or celebrity provenance have sold for even higher. They're not just cars, they're rolling sculptures, time capsules, pieces of Americana. Section 4. The Controversy and the End of the Fin Era. Not everyone loved the 1959 Cadillac. In 1958, social critic John Keats published a book called The Insolent Chariots. Keats argued that American cars had become grotesque, oversized monstrosities. They no longer served their owners. We served them. They demanded constant feeding of expensive gasoline. They were too big for parking spaces. They were, in Keats's view, the ultimate triumph of form over function. 1 year later, the 1959 Cadillac appeared. It was almost as if General Motors had read Keats's book and said, "Hold my beer." Automotive historian Walter McCall described the 1959 Cadillac's fins as flamboyant, ludicrous, and of questionable taste. Other critics were even harsher, calling them excessive, wasteful, and absurd. But here's the thing. The public loved them. Cadillac sales actually improved in 1959. The economy had recovered somewhat from a recession, and buyers were ready to spend. The fins generated controversy, sure, but they also generated attention, and attention sells cars. However, the tide was turning. By 1960, tastes were starting to shift. Tailfins began shrinking across the industry. The 1960 Cadillac still had fins, but they were lower and more restrained. By 1965, Cadillac's rear fenders were completely horizontal. The fin era was over. Why? Several reasons. First, the novelty wore off. Fins had been growing for over a decade. By 1959, they'd reached their logical extreme. There was nowhere left to go. Second, the space-age optimism of the late 1950s began to fade. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 reminded everyone just how close we were to nuclear annihilation. The assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 shook the nation's confidence. The Vietnam War created division and doubt. Third, tastes became more conservative. The early 1960s saw a shift toward cleaner, more elegant design. The 1961 Lincoln Continental, with its simple, understated lines, represented the new aesthetic. Excess was out, restraint was in. Fourth, competition from imports. European cars, smaller, more fuel-efficient, better handling, were gaining popularity. American automakers realized they needed to adapt. And finally, Harley Earl retired. His successor, Bill Mitchell, had a different vision. Mitchell believed in sculpted, muscular forms, but not gaudy excess. Under his leadership, GM design became less ornamental. The 1959 Cadillac represented both the peak and the sunset of an era. It was the moment when American automotive design went as far as it could possibly go in one direction, and then had to turn back. Today, we look at the 1959 Cadillac with a mixture of awe and amusement. It's a car that could only have existed in that specific moment in history. It's absurd, excessive, and utterly impractical. It's also beautiful, bold, and unforgettable. It's America in chrome and steel. Section 5. The Legacy of the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado. So what's the legacy of the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado? First, it's a cultural icon. The car has appeared in countless movies and TV shows, from The Godfather to American Graffiti. Celebrities like Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra owned Eldorados, though the exclusive Biarritz was reserved for the ultra-wealthy like Aristotle Onassis. Second, it represents a specific moment in American history. When you look at a 1959 Cadillac, you're looking at America at the height of its post-war confidence. You're looking at a country that believed the future was unlimited, that technology would solve every problem, and that bigger was always better. Third, it's a reminder of what happens when designers are given freedom to push boundaries. The 1959 Cadillac wasn't designed by committee. It wasn't focus grouped. It was the vision of artists who were told to create something spectacular, and they did. Fourth, it's become a collector's dream. Restoring a 1959 Eldorado is expensive and challenging. Many parts are scarce. Original examples are rare. But for those who take on the project, the result is a showstopper that draws crowds wherever it goes. Finally, it's a cautionary tale. The 1959 Cadillac showed what happens when excess goes unchecked. It's a car that couldn't last, a design philosophy that had to end. And it did. But you know what? We're better off for having lived in a world where the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado existed. It's a car that makes us smile, shake our heads, and wonder what those designers were thinking. Today, automotive design is constrained by fuel economy regulations, safety standards, pedestrian impact requirements, and aerodynamic efficiency. Cars are shaped by wind tunnels and computer simulations. They're rational, practical, and efficient. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado was none of those things. It was pure emotion, pure spectacle, pure American swagger. And those tail fins? They remain the tallest, sharpest, most outrageous fins ever put on a production car. Nobody has topped them since. Nobody ever will. Because you can't recreate the cultural moment that made them possible. You can't recreate Harley Earl. You can't recreate 1959. All we can do is appreciate that it happened, preserve the examples that survive, and remember the era when American cars were works of art that happened to have engines.